So this is a photo I took in Bangkok with my good friend from France. And it's a really nice photo, just a nice portrait. This is shot on a Canon, so the colors are a little bit different than the last two images that we edited, but it's a great photo. And when I see this photo and I see her look and her expression and everything, I just want to edit it in kind of a vintage look. That's just the feeling I get. And I'm really drawn to kind of vintage style portraits. I think they look really cool. So I'm going to edit this photo in that style. And it's actually pretty simple to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do here is adjust the exposure, just go up a tiny bit. Moving down into the highlights, I'm going to increase them a little bit. And that's because we're working with skin here. And when we're working with skin, we really need to make sure that our skin looks good. And we can do that by ensuring that our highlights are at a good level. If we bring down the highlights, the skin kind of gets flat. If we increase the highlights, it really brings out her skin and it looks really good. With the shadows, I'm going to bring them up just a tiny bit, maybe +10. We can bring the whites up a little bit, but we don't want to go overboard because it really just affects her skin in a negative way. So I'm just going to go up to maybe 20, and then I'm going to go down with these blacks here just to increase our contrast there. So the contrast is pretty high here, and vintage photos traditionally didn't have a high contrast look, but we're going to flatten out that contrast in the tone curve. But before we do that, I'm going to go into this global slider here and just bring down the vibrance. And the reason for that is because vintage photos aren't vibrant. They have kind of softer colors. The sensors are old school. They're not vibrant like images are today. So going into the RGB channel here in the tone curve, I'm going to add our famous 3 points. I'm going to drag down the shadows here, and then I'm going to soften everything out. And once again, this softness is what's going to make the photo a vintage look. And the reason for that is because, back in the days of film has very high dynamic range. And when I say dynamic range, I mean it keeps a lot of detail in the highlighted areas and in the shadowed areas. So we can kind of mimic that film look by really flattening out the images. Even though we have a high contrast look, we can really flatten out the blacks and flatten out the whites here in the tone curve. And that's going to give us that vintage style look. So we're going to have a pretty heavy S curve here, and that's going to make sure everything is nice and flat. But here, I think the whites are a little bit strong, so I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to lower the whites a little bit, and then I'm going to increase the exposure because I feel like the photo's a little bit dark. Just kind of going back and forth between the tone curve and the basic adjustments here because that's how we can get the exposure and the light, everything where we want it. But I think that looks pretty good. See the before here, see the after, before, after. So we have like a high contrast look, but it's really flat. I think it looks really good. Now, one of the things I want to do is add a color overlay to this image. And the reason for that is because depending on the film that you'd be shooting with on a film camera, each film has its own kind of tone, its own kind of color. Some films are warmer, some films are cooler, and where cameras have white balance built into them now in the sensors, each film was different, and you used a different film if you were shooting indoors and a different film if you were shooting outdoors on a sunny day, etc. So we can actually do split toning to add kind of a color overlay here, and I'm going to do it with the highlighted areas because we have a lot of highlights and her skin is highlighted, and I'm just going to drag this hue over while holding Option, and that's going to show us 100% saturation of whatever color we're sampling. So I'm dragging over here. I want to go for kind of a warm look. So I'm going to find something kind of orangish, yellowish, and then I'm going to release Option with my left hand, and I'm just going to drag up this saturation slider here until we get that warm look that I want. And that looks pretty good. I think that's pretty cool. You can see the difference here before and after. Before, after. It just adds so much more color, and it gives us that kind of warm summer vibes. I just really like it. So you can also do this with the temperature slider here. You can just increase the warmth there, but that's increasing the warmth of the whole image. And the reason why I like the split toning, because it's kind of leaving these areas, the dark areas, out of the equation. It's not adding this color to those areas. It's only adding this color to the highlighted areas. So split toning is a really cool feature if you want to get this kind of vintage look. But the reason I chose to edit a vintage style photo is not to show you how to use split toning or anything like that. It's to show you how you can implement digital noise grain into your photo to give it texture and give it detail that just makes it more tasteful. So once again, we're going back to the film look, film cameras, especially if you're shooting with a film that had a higher ISO of 800 or 1600. Those films looked really, really grainy. So if you come to the effects here, and you can just take this grain and just bring it up, and we can highlight a dark area here to truly see the level of that grain. So we can drag it up maybe to about 50, and then we can actually increase the size. Now some people, they don't like film grain. They're against it. And that's because, you know, as photography has developed over time, it's always been eliminate as much noise as possible, eliminate as much grain as possible, keep the images as sharp as possible and as most saturated. But there's something beautiful about these old photos that have texture and emotion in them, and they look really good. So I don't think there's any problem with adding some digital grain here. And you can play around with the roughness as well, and that'll just increase the dramaticness of that film grain. And I just think that that's such a better looking photo than soft with no grain. It just adds so much texture, and I think it just looks a lot cooler. So that's why I chose this photo, was to show you guys, you know, how you can add grain to give it a really cool look. But this is a photo that I love, and I actually edit a lot of my portraits in this kind of vintage style look. It's a look I really like, and a lot of my presets in my portrait pack kind of have this look as well, very soft and warm and grainy as well. I think it's a cool look. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope it was a good example of how you can use detail to add a little bit of emotion to your photos. But with that said, I hope one of these styles appealed to you, whether it be the orange and teal look, the dark and moody, or this vintage portrait. These are all styles that I like, but you don't necessarily need to like them. I just hope that it was helpful for you in some way. But with that said, guys, let's move on to the next section.